Let's start coding and create our first map. Before we begin, let's talk a little bit about my setup that I'll be using throughout the course. I'm using brackets like we talked about earlier, so that's going to be set up on the left-hand side of the screen. And then on the right-hand side, I have Chrome, and this will be live preview, so as I make changes over in brackets, it'll get automatically updated. So as we work through the lessons, just keep that in mind. I use this setup because it makes it nice to show you the changes that I'm making, and then you can see the results. Now for this lesson, since we're just starting out, I'm going to maximize brackets so that we can just take a look at the code since we're just getting things set up, and you can see how the code needs to be structured. If you download the sample code or clone the GitHub repository, this is lesson 3.1, you'll see that the lesson contains 3 files: index.html, scripts.js, and styles.css. The index.html file is just our main page, and I'll show you what you need to set that up. The scripts.js is where we'll be doing the majority of the work in future lessons, because that's where we'll interact with the API and add functionality. And styles.css is our style sheet, and that's what we'll be styling the map and other properties that we'll be using in the creation of our course project. So let's take a look at the index.html file here. And this is an HTML5 file, as you can see from the doc type. It's pretty standard. I have a head element, and I've created the title. And one thing to note is that I've set the viewport here so that it'll maximize to the device width. I've also included a style sheet here, the styles.css, which we talked about. And near the bottom of the body tag, I've included scripts.js. So this will load when we start working on interacting with the Google Map. This is where the code will reside. So there's a couple things you need to do in here in order to start incorporating the Google Map. The first thing that we need to do is include the script tag, which pulls down the Google Maps API. So I'm going to go ahead and just paste that in here. And so what this is doing is it's calling and pulling down the JavaScript API. Right now we're going to use a stable release. Remember earlier we talked about setting v=3 will pull down the latest stable release. And what you're going to want to do is you're going to include your API key here that we talked about earlier, that we found through the developer console. And you can do that by just adding key equals and then pasting in your API key. So go ahead and add your key in here. For the purposes of these lessons, I'm not going to include a key because it works, and it just allows you during development so you can paste your own key in here. But again, I'd recommend before you go live with any sites that you paste your API key in here, and that way you can monitor your site and see how things are going. The next thing you're going to do is define a div or an element that you can attach the Google Map to. For the purpose of this lesson, we're going to define an ID equal to map. This ID can be whatever you want, and over in the JavaScript I'll show you how you can get this element and assign the map object to it. And so that's all there is to it in the index.html. Let's go over and check out the style sheet. Now the styles for the map, what we want is a totally responsive map that fills up the entire browser. So to do that, we're going to take the HTML body and the map ID tag and set the height to 100% and set both margins equal to 0. And that will extend the map so that it fits across the full width and height of the browser. A little bit later we'll talk about how you can use styling to actually set the height and the width to a fixed value if you want. So let's say, for example, if you have a page and you wanted just a small map, say on your contact page showing where your business was located, you can set the height and the width in order to make the map fit within the rest of your page. Okay, let's take a look at scripts.js. For now, I've removed everything out of scripts.js so I can show you how to build up the Google Map and add it to your site. The first thing that you're going to want to do is go ahead and add a global variable that will be the container for your Google Map object. And for this lesson, and throughout the course, we're going to just call it map. The next thing you want to do is define a function that gets called when the DOM finishes loading. We're going to call that function loadMap. Now within the loadMap function, what we're going to do is instantiate the map object by passing two parameters into the constructor. And that's going to be the DOM element of the container that we want to use to hold the map, and a set of options for configuring the map setup. Now we want to store this object to our global variable that we called map. And what we're going to want to do is use the new keyword and then define google.maps, and then after this is where we define all our classes and methods and properties. So we're going to define the map object. Now the first parameter we want to pass in is the DOM element. So what we need to do is actually get that value. So we're going to define map ID and then do get element by ID. Now remember, in the HTML file we defined a div with the ID of map, and so that's why we're going to use map here. So we're going to want to pass that map ID as the first parameter into the constructor. Now the next parameter that we want to pass in is a set of options that will be used to configure the basic setup of the map. So let's go ahead and call that map options. And we need to define that variable. There's two required parameters when you go about setting a map: zoom and the center point of the map. There's a bunch of other variables that we'll talk about in the next lesson for configuring the map, but for right now those are the two required variables that you'll need to set up. Let's set the center of the map, and you do that by defining center and then using the Google Map helper function called lat_long, and then passing in the center point that you want to use for the map. You also want to go ahead and set the zoom of the map. Now the way the zoom works is 0 is farthest out. That shows the full map of the US, as we talked about in the geography review. And then as you work your way down, the higher values are the farther you have zoomed in. So we'll just set kind of a regional view, and we'll set the zoom equal to 11 here. Now what you need to do is you need to bind this load map function to the DOM so that when the window finishes loading, you could load the map API. Now there's two ways of doing that. The way we're going to use it is Google has an event handler called add DOM listener, which will do it for you, or you can use the onLoad event in the body tag. So google.maps event.add DOM listener, and it takes the window, and the event is going to be on load, and then we'll call the load map function that we created above. We'll go ahead and save that. We'll go ahead and refresh the map here, and you can see this created a basic map. We use the lat_long center of New York, and you can see it's set up default controls. Since we only defined two parameters to be the zoom and the center, it's used the defaults for all the other options on the map. Let's walk through some of the default controls and functionality of this basic map we've created. So the first thing you're going to want to call out is the pan controls here. So you can move left, right, up, and down. We've got the zoom controls here, so you can zoom in and zoom out. We've enabled the street view control, so you can drag that onto, click it, and then drag it onto the map. Select your roadway of interest, and that'll bring up street view. You can pan and zoom and look around. And then up here in the far right hand corner, you can see the default is the map, the base map layer. You can set terrain if you want, or you can set satellite, and then you have control of whether or not you want the labels on there, the streets, the roads, the points of interest, the names. You also have mouse control, so you can pan and zoom and move around the map using the mouse. All of the styling on the map is the basic styling, and we'll talk about it in a future lesson how you can change that. Now let's go back to the style sheet and talk a little bit about what if you wanted to set a fixed height and width. Well, you can do that fairly easily by setting both the width and the height in CSS. So let's say that you wanted 640 by 480 map. And you can see how that works as it just goes ahead and sets the container size, the div element, to be your map. So you can set that to whatever height and width you want, or you can make it fully responsive if you needed to. So this lesson we gave an overview of how to create your first map leveraging the Google Maps API.